Okay, we have a couple of goals for today. One is to think about World War II as a major turning point in the federal government's power. Second is to think about the Cold War and the consequences of a war that never seems to have a clear starting and ending point. And third, I'll talk about the rise of the UN and human rights, something that often gets overlooked in survey courses. So let's start by talking about the federal government. The traditional story is that the New Deal is the turning point of federal power. But there's a case to be made that World War II is the real turning point. The federal government spends more money during World War II than during the entire New Deal. The real turning point for tax collection is World War II, not the New Deal. Some of the most radical programs that allow the state to control parts of the economy are implemented during World War II, not during the New Deal. So World War II is also a turning point in America's role in the world, and we'll get to that as we go through the lecture. Let's start, when you look at what the U.S. spends on defense during World War II and compare it not only to past wars but to past federal budgets, the numbers are just simply staggering. What the U.S. spends on defense alone during World War II surpasses the total spending in all the past federal budgets combined. You can see here that the cost of New Deal programs don't come close to what the federal government is spending on World War II. And you can also see the defense spending is a huge part of the American economy. Right, so this is a huge increase in federal spending. So who's paying for this? Well, World War II is the turning point in federal tax collection in the United States. You might expect that the New Deal would be the turning point, but you can see here, as late as 1939, 93% of the workforce was not paying federal income taxes. And that's not because they refused to pay, it's because the tax burden to pay for the New Deal fell on the wealthy and the most well-paid professional classes. And remember that I'm talking about federal income taxes here, not Social Security taxes. The percentage of people paying for things like Social Security is far higher than 7%. It's not until World War II that the majority of the workforce begins to pay income taxes. You can see here that suddenly personal income tax surpasses corporate taxes as the largest source of federal revenue. So what does this mean for workers? Well, let's take a worker that is making the equivalent of maybe $33,000 in 2013. In 1940, this person paid no income tax. By the end of World War II, the worker is paying an effective tax rate of 12.3%. If we take a look at wealthy Americans, you can see how they are paying an incredible amount of taxes during this period as compared with tax rates that we live with now. Right now, these people would pay tax rates of maybe 39%. During World War II, someone making the equivalent of $1.6 million faced a 70% income tax rate. Someone making the equivalent of $16.7 million faced a 90% tax rate. And you can see here how the war impacts the economy. The economy didn't fully recover during the New Deal from the Great Depression. It's not until World War II when the federal government pumps an unprecedented amount of money into the economy in order to produce the goods necessary for war that the U.S. finally gets out of the Great Depression. You can see in this slide that through the combination of increased tax rates on wealthy Americans and a thriving economy where unemployment went down and wages went up, the richest 1%'s share of wealth begins to go down. Remember that many scholars argue that one of the causes of the Great Depression was the high disparities of wealth in the United States. Another example of expanding federal power is the Office of Price Administration. And I've copied part of the directions for the office if you're interested in reading it in the slide, but it's not necessary to copy all of it. The Office of Price Administration had the power to control prices on certain consumer goods and services. It's a power that was largely missing from the New Deal. You can see here the broad powers that the office could exercise, setting ceiling prices on residential rents and commodities and rationing certain consumer goods that were scarce because of the war effort. The anticipation of World War II also gave the federal government a new power, the power to draft Americans before the United States was officially involved in a war. It created a system that we're familiar with, the Selective Service System. And we saw briefly in one of the past lectures how World War I expanded the federal government's power, and you read about that in terms of how it dealt with dissent. You can see something similar going on here. The Second War Powers Act gave the president the power to censor mail and other forms of communication. The president could acquire land for military purposes, and it repealed confidential census data, which allowed the FBI to identify Japanese Americans. And so World War II, went much farther than World War I in dealing with potential dissenters and people considered dangerous to the war effort. While 5,000 German and Italian non-U.S. citizens deemed dangerous were held during World War II, most Americans sympathetic to the Nazis or Italian fascism were not in prison during the war. Yet with Executive Order 9066, 112,000 Japanese Americans living in California, Oregon, and Washington were relocated to internment camps. And importantly, they were relocated simply because they were of Japanese descent, not because the government had evidence that these individuals were a threat to American security. As one military official said, quote, "The Japanese race is an enemy race." And you can see here where these internment camps were located, most of them in the Intermountain West. And what you can see in all of these examples is that World War II is the turning point, right, in the federal government's power. The federal government goes well beyond the New Deal in spending and in intervening into Americans' lives. And so I also had you read a lot for today, a lot about what happens after World War II. In particular, you read about the Cold War, you read about McCarthyism, you read about the amount of money the U.S. begins to spend on defense. And so I want to help put all of this into perspective a bit. Right? Historically, wars have been moments when Americans have been most comfortable, or at least most accommodating of big expansions in federal power and spending. Right? They are moments when the federal government has been allowed to take away civil liberties, create large new departments, and spend unprecedented amounts of money. The logic behind this is that these things are temporary war measures that have an endpoint, right, when the war comes to an end. The Cold War begins a different period in American history where there seems to be no clear distinction between wartime and peacetime. And when that happens, the federal government can continually exercise war powers, even when the United States is not in a major conflict like World War II. Right, you can see here all of the military campaigns that the U.S. recognizes and has given medals for. And you can see that since World War II, there hasn't been a single year where the U.S. hasn't been engaged in some type of military campaign. If you think about it, much of Americans' understandings of war powers had come from large-scale wars against other major powers. But the Cold War adapts those war powers to a continuous stream of small wars. Even the biggest wars of the era, the Korean War and the Vietnam War, were small in comparison to World War II. Right? And so, Marilyn Young, a historian, has a great passage that gets to the heart of this issue, where she writes that post-World War II presidential administrations, quote, had to create a public tolerance for war as normal rather than aberrational. So normal that after a while, only those who were actually engaged in fighting it and their families noticed it was being fought at all. So what we have to keep in mind is that the United States builds a national security state in the post-World War II world, right, in a new environment where there was not really an endpoint to war. And so the words that the federal government begins to use reflects that new world. We get the National Security Act, which brought all of the military branches under the same bureaucracy. The Department of War becomes the Department of Defense. Right? Military budgets were no longer called war spending, but defense spending instead. These all signal a new world where the divisions between wartime and peacetime are blurred. Okay, so in this last section, I want to bring in something that's not in your textbook, but it's important to remember that the institutionalization of human rights and the rise of the Cold War emerge in the same post-World War II moment. And so what makes the post-war institutionalization of human rights different from past concepts of rights? Well, before the 1940s, grand visions of universal rights, which means rights shared by all people, were espoused in documents like the French Declaration of Man and Citizen and the American Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, for example, stated certain inalienable rights like the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? It didn't state that only Americans were entitled to these rights. It suggested that these were rights that all humans deserved. But still, documents like this assumed that these universal rights would be protected by nation states. They were not calling for an international body to oversee how different nations treated their citizens. As far as the international community was concerned, nations could still do whatever they wanted inside their borders. But that changed as the atrocities of the Holocaust were revealed. What makes the post-World War II period unique is that international organizations emerged to articulate and protect universal rights. So we look at August 8th, 1945. It's a transformational day in this story. On the same day that the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki, Japan, which killed 60,000 people, the President of the United States, Harry Truman, signed the United Nations Charter, officially making the U.S. part of the UN Security Council, an organization that would ratify one of the most revolutionary documents articulating human rights, which I'll talk about in a few moments. What also happens on August 8th is the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union agreed to form an international military tribunal to punish German war criminals. And what comes out of the International Military Tribunal are the Nuremberg trials. The trials are important because nation states were generally punished after wars, not individuals. Right? But the Nuremberg trials planned to bring individual Germans in front of an international court created specifically to try Germans. There were three types of crimes under which Germans were to be tried: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And importantly, the only crimes that actually existed in writing and recognized by Germans before World War II were war crimes. Right? These were crimes embedded in treaties meant to define the laws of war. And these included rules about how to treat civilians and prisoners of war. The other two types of crime didn't exist before the end of World War II. The Allies basically made them up and applied them to the actions of Germans. And so let's focus here on the crimes against the humanity, which was made up after the war. And so that was basically defined as namely murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population before or during the war, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds, and execution of or in connection with any crime within the jurisdiction of the tribunal, whether or not violation of a domestic law of the country where perpetrated. Right, again, crimes against humanity didn't exist before World War II. But suddenly after the war, here was an international tribunal prosecuting German officials for violations of human rights. In the initial trial, 12 German officials were sentenced to death, 3 sentenced to life in prison, and 4 received prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. And so the International Military Tribunal was a short-term organization to deal with the consequences of war. The United Nations has a much more long-lasting impact. And one of those, commissions that's created by the UN is the UN Commission on Human Rights, which was formed in 1946 and chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of FDR, who died as president in April 1945. And so the commission has 53 members from around the world. Together, they produce a revolutionary document that would influence the post-World War II world, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The document really laid out basic rights that should be granted to all humans, no matter what country they resided in. And after 1,400 rounds of voting, the General Assembly of the UN adopted the document on December 10th, 1948. And I encourage you to go out and look at the document if you've never read it before. But I'm just going to point out a couple pieces of the document and go through it. So you're going to start writing a paper about civil rights, right? And so let's look at Article 2 in order to discuss how the new attention to human rights might impact the United States during the Cold War. And Article 2 simply states that everyone is entitled to all rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, religion, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. And this is where we can see where the institutionalization of human rights in the Cold War intersect. Right? It also shows how this intersection pushed the federal government in the U.S. to intervene in domestic issues. In fighting the Cold War, the U.S. was hoping to court countries as allies and stop the expansion of communism. But racial discrimination and segregation in the U.S., a clear violation of the Declaration of Human Rights, brought international attention and was not only embarrassing to the United States, it had geopolitical consequences. Right? The irony of the United States campaign to court allies by promoting democracy while segregating its own citizens by race was not lost on much of the world. So here you can see in Greece, a writer noted, quote, "America has its Achilles heel, and the heel is quite black." After visiting the American South, the writer recounted an African-American child who responded to the question, what punishment should be imposed on Hitler? And the child said, quote, "I would paint his face black and send him to America immediately." And so the Soviet press reported accounts of racism in the South, especially brutal lynchings. And in 1949, according to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, racial discrimination was one of the principal, was part of Soviet propaganda themes regarding the U.S. And there are lots of stories. Non-white foreign dignitaries and reporters who suffered discrimination created even more trouble for the U.S. during the Cold War. One example, the Haitian Secretary of Agriculture traveled to Biloxi, Mississippi in 1947. He was invited to attend a conference of the National Association of Commissioners, Secretaries, and Directors of Agriculture. And so they didn't know that he was black when he was invited, and so he shows up to the Biloxi Buena Vista Hotel to confirm his reservation, and he arrives, and he's informed that for, quote, reasons of color, he would not be able to stay at the hotel. He could not eat at the restaurant. Right? Another story, in 1947, Gandhi's physician was barred from a restaurant during his visit to the U.S. In 1945, Pan American Airways refused to allow a Jamaican journalist to eat at its Miami airport public restaurant. Right? And so one of the reasons that the U.S. is so concerned about the United States' image as a racist country abroad is because African countries were gaining independence from colonial rule during this period. And you can see on this slide just a really short list of African countries that gained independence during the Cold War. And so suddenly the U.S. has to fight for allies in Africa. And racism in the U.S. is an easy propaganda tool for the Soviet Union, as the Soviets were also searching for allies in Africa. And so knowing that it would embarrass the U.S. in the context of the Cold War, American citizens also used the Declaration of Human Rights to push for racial equality in the United States. On October 23, 1947, the NAACP filed a petition with the UN protesting the treatment of African Americans in the U.S. It denounced U.S. race discrimination as, quote, not only indefensible, but barbaric. It claimed that racism harmed the nation as a whole. It said, quote, it is not Russia that threatens the United States, the NAACP claimed in the petition, so much as Mississippi, not Stalin and Molotov, but Bilbo and Rankin. Internal justice done to one's brothers is far more dangerous than the aggression of strangers abroad. In December 1948, the UN provided civil rights activists another tool when the UN General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And it defined genocide as the attempt to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, which genocidal actions included killing persons or causing serious bodily harm to persons because they were members of a particular group. And so in 1951, the Civil Rights Congress filed a petition in the UN charging that the U.S. government had committed genocide against African Americans in violation of the Genocide Convention. And the petition included the documentation of 153 killings, 344 other crimes of violence against African Americans, and other human rights abuses committed in the U.S. The petition claimed, quote, out of the inhuman black ghettos of American cities, out of the cotton plantations of the South, comes this record of mass slayings on the basis of race, of lives deliberately warped and distorted by the willful creation of conditions making for premature death, poverty, and disease. It is a record that calls aloud for condemnation, for an end to these terrible injustices that constitute a daily and ever-increasing violation of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Another example where you can see how concern over the United States image abroad impacted the federal government's response to the civil rights movement is in Brown v. Board, right, the famous Supreme Court case. And so when the Supreme Court hears a case, amicus briefs are filed, and they're otherwise known as friends of the court briefs. And basically parties in the with an interest in the case, but they're not really a plaintiff or a defendant, can write a brief to the court which tries to persuade the court. And so the Justice Department filed an amicus brief in Brown. And the Justice Department argues that the court needed to rule that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional because, quote, in the context of the present world struggle between freedom and tyranny, that the problem of racial discrimination must be viewed. The United States is trying to prove to the people of the world of every nationality, race, and color that a free democracy is the most civilized and most secure form of government yet devised by man, end quote. So by 1954, the United States' new global position was really pushing the federal government to intervene in new ways in domestic affairs. Right? And so on the one hand, the rise of the Cold War and human rights provided new opportunities for the civil rights movement. At the same time, the Cold War especially had negative consequences for the civil rights movement. From the end of World War I through the end of World War II, many people in the early civil rights movement were communists. And the reason for this is because the Communist Party in the United States was one of the only organizations that promoted full equality for all people, regardless of race. And so there were African Americans like Lovett Fort Whiteman, who was born in Dallas and found communism the best way to fight for racial equality in the U.S. Fort Whiteman traveled to Moscow. He gave speeches in front of Stalin and Ho Chi Minh and tried to organize white and black workers in the U.S. And the Communist Party also provided legal defense for African Americans facing fabricated charges in the South. So many of the best African American organizers had some affiliation with communism, even if they didn't consider themselves communists. And the problem with this in the post-war period is that opponents of the civil rights movement will use these communist affiliations against activists. And what happens in the post-World War II years is that most of the major civil rights organizations have to purge their membership rolls of people that had any communist ties. And that meant purging many of the people with the most organizational experience. right? So again, on the one hand, the Cold War and human rights provided great opportunities for the civil rights movement because the federal government was interested in challenging certain forms of discrimination in order to improve its image abroad. At the same time, the Cold War gave opponents of the civil rights movement a political tool to attack activists by connecting them to communism. And so I'll end quickly just pointing out one other piece of this document and its impact on the U.S. during the Cold War. Article 14 covers the right to asylum from persecution. And this creates new responsibilities for countries like the U.S. in how they approach political refugees. And so it becomes important during the Cold War in places like Hungary, as Hungarians tried to overthrow the Soviet regime in 1956. And so in November 1956, my grandfather was a member of the Hungarian army. He wakes up one morning in the barracks outside of Budapest, where the revolution was beginning. He walked outside to see Soviet tanks pointed at his barracks. Right? He goes back in, he finds some wire cutters, he cuts through the fence of the barracks, and he flees to a local farmhouse and hides. And once it appeared safe, he made his way back to Budapest, saw his family, and eventually takes a train to the border to try to escape Hungary. And so at this border town, he finds someone who is helping people try to escape, and he kept my grandfather at his house. That night, the man pointed my grandfather in the direction of Austria, and my grandfather crawls for miles underneath guard towers until he makes his way to a cemetery where he couldn't read the headstone, so he knows he's outside of Hungary now. A police officer picks him up and brings him to a shelter, and eventually makes his way to a United Nations camp where countries from all around the world were there to accept Hungarian refugees. Each country had its own table, and he eventually makes his way to the United States table, where they ask my grandfather if he was a communist. He says no, and a few days later, he's on a plane to the United States. Right? I use this example because here are just some of the real-world impacts of this simultaneous rise of the Cold War and the institutionalization of human rights.